Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today we are just reading a single text, or I should say this week, we are just tackling one particular text, a short story called Sonny's Blues, written by James Baldwin. I'm guessing that maybe at least some of us have read this before, or at least it's been assigned in some previous class that we've taken. And if you have read it before, that's okay. If you took a class with Dr. Cooley and read it in there, or you may have read it with me if you took one of my 203 sections. I'm not really sure if that applies to any of us, but or it could be a totally different class at a different institution. But if you have read the short story before, don't worry. That's not a problem. That's not really an issue. I would like you to go ahead and read it again, even if you feel like you remember it and you still feel like you're pretty familiar with it from the previous time. It's never a bad thing. It's never a bad habit in a literature class to reread something. And of course, professors say this a lot. You've probably heard this before, but it really is true, and it bears repeating. When you read something the first time, you'll gain a good understanding. You can do a lot with it, but you're always going to miss stuff. On that initial reading, you're never going to catch everything. It's never going to be quite as thorough of a reading as maybe you would like. And part of that, and you guys sort of know this just from your own experience, but when you're reading something for the first time, everything's new, right? You have to adjust to the author's prose style. You have to adjust to the narrator's voice. You have to adjust to maybe certain types of plot developments or time sequences, certain kinds of dialect or dialogue. There could be a lot of new things. It might be a genre that you're not very familiar with, or just there might be other stylistic elements that you don't typically encounter. So that first read through is often just a way to sort of get familiar with the text, to understand what's going on. Okay, you know the characters, you know the basic beats of the plot. But again, a lot of that's just kind of surface level, like basic comprehension. That's often what we gain primarily from that first reading. And then if we want to engage in some deeper, closer analysis, we often need to go back and we need to read it again. And if we're not going to read it from start to finish a second time, we at least need to go back and probably reread specific passages if we're ever going to, work with that text again. But again, reading it all the way through a second time or even a third time in some cases is usually good, because you're going to learn more, you're going to notice more, and you'll have a greater understanding of the overall text. So, like I said, if you've already read Sonny's Blues, just read it again and see kind of the difference. If you are already somewhat familiar with the text, notice that when you go back to it again and you're not paying quite as much attention to the plot and you sort of know Baldwin's style a little bit, I think you'll notice that you're able to do more. You're able to push your analysis further on that second or maybe even third reading, because a lot of the basic stuff that you're working on with the first reading has already been done. That's already sort of filed away. So that could be a good experience for some of us. And if you haven't read the story before, then at least read it once. And if you have time, maybe read it a second time as well. It's not a terribly long story. I think in our book, it's about 22 pages, just slightly over 20 pages. But of course, we have pretty small font in our book. So I thought it would be enough for this week, kind of a lighter week in terms of overall reading, a little bit lighter than what we've had a few other weeks, but I really wanted us to focus on this story. I know sometimes when I give you 2 or 3 different texts to read, or maybe a whole group of poems, it can maybe be a little bit difficult to dive into each one. So this week I thought it would be fun to really just, focus on a single short story, really read it closely, and I thought we could pursue a few different lines of inquiry today. We could do what we've been doing, talk about potential ways that we could analyze this text, talk about some threads we could pursue, some different ways to maybe formulate some arguments, but I also just wanted us to kind of practice a little bit more with historical and cultural context. I know we talked a lot about it last week when we were discussing A Raisin in the Sun and then some of the poetry by Gwendolyn Brooks, but here's another chance if we're interested in the historical and cultural context. Here's another chance to really dig into it and to maybe make some really interesting discoveries that we could later use in our analysis. So one way this story often gets read, and you'll see it if you read the little blurb about Baldwin in our book, the story often gets read as sort of a tale of redemption, and it's often connected very closely, like the plot, the thematic material, it's all connected very much to music. Music seems to play a pretty big role in the short story. Many critics and scholars over the years have picked up on that, and they've sort of made the case, I think this is how the editors put it in the book, that it's sort of a story of redemption through music, or it perhaps demonstrates how music can serve a sort of healing function, how it can maybe bring people together, how it can help people potentially deal with trauma and other difficult things in their lives. Yeah, I mean, I think we can see that, we can observe that in the story. I think most of us will sort of notice that or read it in that way to some extent. But I think we can complicate it a little bit. The ending is a bit ambiguous, so we can talk about that. We can talk about maybe what we think might be next for these characters. But I really wanted us to dig more into the music. Because again, there's a common interpretation that's been at work for a long time where it's just like, oh yeah, it's kind of connected to jazz music or the blues. And we've already been talking about this a little bit in relation to some of the other texts we've read, how a lot of these postmodern writers working in sort of the post-World War II era, 50s, 60s, that's where most of our stuff has been so far, they're influenced by the popular music of the time. Right, so we talked about this with Kerouac. We've talked about this with some of our poets as well. So we've mentioned some of the ways that these writers' styles, their writing styles, their prose styles, might borrow things from music. So we've talked about certain rhythms or cadences. We've talked about maybe how the words sound sometimes, but we've also talked about sentence structure. And we've talked about how they were maybe sort of influenced in some ways, or definitely, not maybe, influenced in some ways by sort of improvisation, the kind of improvisation you would find at times in jazz music or the blues. So we mentioned this at least a little bit with Kerouac in particular, how some of his sentences kind of open up and he starts to ignore a few punctuation or, other types of mechanical conventions that he does often follow at other times. But then when he wants to convey maybe a certain emotion, or when he's describing a character like Dean, who's kind of out there and doing a lot of eccentric stuff and often doing things very fast, doing many things at once, talking fast, doing physical actions in kind of a rapid fire manner, we noticed that the sentences kind of changed and they would often get longer. They would sometimes get a little bit sort of chaotic, or they would feel a little bit more sort of kinetic, fast moving. There might not have been as much punctuation or separation between different clauses. So we noticed that, and we sort of, many of you talked about it on the discussion board that week, how, some of that does put us in mind of maybe certain kinds of music. And once we start getting into Baldwin, we're going to see some of the same ideas, some of the same points being made in the book. So I know this time they're not consecutive, but if you guys would read the little biographical blurb about James Baldwin, that starts on page 335. So take a look at that. It gives a nice overview of his career and his style. And he's not just a fiction writer. I mean, obviously, we're only reading his fiction in here, but he's a pretty important figure, really, in American sort of 20th century cultural life, kind of, cultural and intellectual history. He wrote a lot of essays, so he didn't strictly write fiction, but he also wrote short stories and a few novels. And this particular story is often considered one of his best works of fiction. So read the blurb about him, and if you like him, if you like Sonny's Blues and you have some more time on your hands, you can read Going to Meet the Man. That's the other example of short fiction that we get from him in the book. But of course, Sonny's Blues does not start until page 348. So when you're reading the intro to Baldwin, they'll once again make this connection to music. And they'll specifically mention African American spirituals and gospel music as well. And they sort of mention that Baldwin, came from a very religious family, went to church a lot as a young person, actually became a child preacher when he was 13 or 14 or something. But he stopped doing that after a few years, and then he became sort of estranged from the church when he got older. But they talk about how the church always had this strong influence on the way he wrote. Partly based on the music, partly based on some of the emotional sort of wavelengths that might have been at work there. So that's a common thing that critics point out, right? I mean, we're going to encounter that a lot if we read anything about Baldwin. If we read other articles or books about Baldwin, they'll make that point, and they'll talk about how his prose is influenced by gospel music, African American spirituals, and then maybe jazz and the blues as well. And obviously, those more popular music forms. And again, we'll talk about sort of a split between what's called secular music and more church-oriented music. But there's this argument being made that all of that stuff, the blues, jazz, gospel, spirituals, the kind of songs you would sing in church, all of that influenced Baldwin in terms of his style, in terms of how he wrote his sentences and paragraphs, but also some of these larger thematic concerns or emotional states that he was attempting to depict. So we'll see that, and I think we'll all kind of understand that on a basic level. But what I thought we could do today, just as one way to get closer to the text and maybe get ready to analyze it further, I thought we could push more on this connection between music and the actual prose that we see on the page. Because often these are the kinds of statements we might see and we might even repeat in some of our own work. And oh yeah, he's influenced by the music, rhythm, cadence, sort of ecstatic sort of states at times, but also sort of encountering, sorrow, sadness, wandering in the wilderness, whatever. Like, we can all sort of talk generally about that stuff. But sometimes it helps to push a little more and get more specific. So it's one thing to say, yes, he was influenced by the rhythms and the improvisation of popular music of that era, such as the blues and jazz. But what do we really mean when we say that? I mean, what do we really mean when we talk about that influence? Can we really identify it? Can we point to it in the text instead of just making sort of a generalized, sort of summarizing statement that's true and perhaps useful, but we can always do a little more. And this is going to give us a chance to think more about some of the context that surrounds this particular narrative. So again, not everybody loves to do a lot of historical and cultural context, but if that's something that you like to pursue, if that's a way you like to generate analysis, if you are often interested in the historical background, that sort of is on display in certain literary texts, then it's a great chance here to really think more about music. And this requires some research, and it requires a little bit of digging, because we're going back to a previous era. Now, some of you might be jazz fans, or you might be big fans of the blues. Maybe you guys are really familiar with these musical genres and you listen to them and you know some of the notable artists. But for a lot of readers, this stuff is going to feel pretty distant, like some of the references to particular musicians or particular songs. And we get that in the short story, right? Specific jazz musicians get referenced, and you should check the footnotes. If you're not familiar with them, look them up. I mean, you probably know who Louis Armstrong is. You might not be that familiar with Charlie Parker, but Google him. I mean, he's got a Wikipedia page. You can go and read up on him. I mean, of course, he's dead, but there is a Wikipedia page about him. So just get a little bit acquainted with some of that stuff, just in terms of knowing the references, maybe even looking up some of the song titles, particularly "Am I Blue?" because that's a famous song. I mean, we don't maybe hear it as much anymore, but it was very popular in mid-century. It's a pretty old song. I think it dates back maybe even earlier than that, but it was covered a lot. I mean, it was just sort of like a standard. It got played a lot in nightclubs and, other music venues. If you liked popular music of that time, you would have known that song. I mean, it was a song that would have been very familiar to a lot of people and a lot of readers back in the 1950s. So not as familiar to us, and that's why we have to do a little bit of digging, maybe a little bit of research. But I thought we could go even further, and it's great to know some of the artists, it's great to know some of the songs, but I thought we could get even more sort of detailed and specific when it comes to thinking about the music and how the music shows up in the short story. So we can think about this on a couple of different levels. I mean, obviously, in a very literal way, music is present in the story. Just by starting with the character of Sonny, who is an aspiring musician, right? He is a piano player, and we learn a fair amount about his musical ambitions. We learn a little bit about how he sort of, becomes proficient at the music, how he practices, but of course he also gets into trouble with drugs. And, the non-linear plot, it can be a little hard to follow if you're not paying close attention, but it's really expertly done. It's a masterfully sort of woven narrative because we move back and forth in time, but we learn a lot. It's a really efficient story, pretty compact, a little bit longer than some short stories, but a lot of information gets conveyed in a relatively compact size here. We learn a lot about Sonny. We sort of zero in or zoom in on some particular moments in time. I think Baldwin's really good at that because obviously with a short story, we don't typically get the amount of character development or the types of, really extensive plots that we would see in a novel. But we get certain conversations, often between Sonny and the narrator. We sort of zoom in on very specific moments in Sonny's sort of progression and development as a person, and also for the narrator, right? Because their stories are intertwined. Obviously, they're brothers. So, we have these very particular moments, very specific scenes, and then we'll jump ahead or we'll move back. So it's a non-linear plot, but it moves very nicely. I think it gives us a lot of information about these two characters, and a lot of Sonny's story is, of course, tied up in music and his dreams of being a jazz musician, as he tells his narrator brother at one point. And that's a very telling conversation. Again, it's stuff that if we don't learn a little bit about the context, it's going to be lost on us. So that's a great exchange. I'm not sure if I wrote down the page number for that, but you guys should really notice that. It's during one of the conversations between the two of them. It's when Sonny's sort of telling his brother, I want to be a musician. And his brother, not being as much of a music fan, is like, well, what kind of musician, And Sonny sort of having fun, kind of, joking around a little bit. And he's like, well, how many do you think there are? And then eventually Sonny levels with them and says, well, I want to play jazz. I want to be a jazz musician. And his brother mentions Louis Armstrong. And just notice the reaction of Sonny. Sonny's very explicit. He's very clear. No. I don't want to play music like that. Okay, Louis Armstrong was, of course, very famous. People still know who he is. Sort of a famous early jazz figure. But even by this point in the 50s, we're kind of in this general, like, post-war, kind of like a Raisin in the Sun, probably somewhere between the end of World War II and, the late 50s, because we know both of these characters served, I believe, during World War II. I think that's the war that they were both, involved in. They both served sort of at different times, I think, but there might have been some overlap. The narrator, I think, was in the Army. Sonny later, believed, joined the Navy. But so we're in that same general period. So even in the 50s, Sonny thought that Louis Armstrong was lame, right? That's old. He goes that kind of old style, down home music. That's not what I want to play. And then when his brother's like, well, okay, what do you want to do? Sonny mentions Charlie Parker. He calls him Bird, which was the nickname he was often called by. So again, it wouldn't hurt to just read up a little bit on Parker and find out how he's different from some of his jazz predecessors. What was different about his style, the way he played? What would have sort of prompted that reaction from Sonny to kind of scorn Louis Armstrong? Like, no, I don't want to play what that guy played. I want to be more in the mold of Charlie Parker. So knowing a little bit about the differences between those musicians would be helpful just to understand Sonny's position, just so we kind of understand the character a little bit better. We don't need to be experts about the music, but if you don't know anything about those two musicians, then you're not really going to be able to pick up on the particular tenor and meaning of that conversation. And again, Sonny's kind of laughing at his brother a little bit because his brother's not really hip. He's not really up to date on the popular music or what was popular for people like Sonny. He wasn't up on that. He didn't know very much about that, and his ignorance is kind of showing, and Sonny is kind of a little scornful in that particular moment. So again, just it kind of helps to know a little bit about that stuff. So and then later, of course, we have the actual musical performance, which really takes up the final 3 pages of the story and can kind of be viewed as a climactic moment, sort of a triumphant moment, maybe emotional in some ways. It might be the time where that connection between prose and music is most evident, is most clear, if we're sort of looking at a few of Baldwin's individual sentences. But also just a sort of virtuoso description of music being played. It's kind of a notorious thing amongst writers or people who study writing that it's really hard to capture music in writing, right? It's a hard way to do it because, of course, the reader can't hear the music. So it's hard to just describe what it looks like when people play music, or to describe verbally what music sounds like, because I think a lot of people who love music or just listen to music will kind of agree that there's certain maybe emotional valences or certain kind of even intellectual things or certain things that music brings out in us or evokes in us that isn't always easily captured in words. It's often just sort of a feeling, and feelings can sometimes be difficult to describe. So Baldwin is sort of thought of as doing this, really masterful job of sort of capturing that performance and really how it functions on multiple levels, kind of what it looks like with the musicians up on stage, Sonny on the piano, Creole playing bass, and then they have a drummer. I'm not sure if we ever catch his name, but it's an ensemble, right? It's a three-person ensemble playing jazz. Although the term blues also gets thrown around a lot in that passage, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the distinction between those terms and how they also kind of bleed together. But in that scene, of course, it's all about music, and it's about how Sonny is using music as sort of a vehicle to not just express himself. I think we all get that. Obviously music does that. It's a form of expression. But there's more to it than that, right? Sonny's also going through a lot of stuff, right? A lot of trauma. He was in jail. He struggled with drug addiction. He's been estranged from his family. And the narrator doesn't even know all of the things that Sonny's gone through because they have spent some of this time kind of estranged, not seeing a ton of each other. So Sonny's gone through some bad times, and he's sort of working through a lot of that by playing the piano, but not just by playing, but by playing a particular kind of music. the kind of music he wants to play, the kind of music that has inspired him to be a musician. So what we need to sort of understand is that they're playing, like I said, sort of a jazz and blues standard, Am I Blue, a song that was written previously but got played all the time. But he's improvising, he's sort of doing his own, he's putting his own stamp on it, or he's kind of riffing, doing his own kind of tangent, which would have been characteristic of jazz or the blues. So before we go any further, I just wanted to share with you guys, if you don't mind me just reading a little bit, I just wanted to share some general information about the music. And if you already know some of this stuff, forgive me. This can just be review, or you can even skip over this part of the video. But if you're not super familiar with the blues or jazz music, it might be helpful to listen to this, and then you can do a little bit of additional research if you want. But this is just a really general overview, just to give us a basic understanding of the music. And then once we have that understanding, we can jump into a deeper level of analysis with Baldwin's text. So just bear with me here. I got a lot of this from the Library of Congress website, so it's pretty dry but informative. So the term rhythm and blues, which is often shortened to R&B, that sort of genre of music, it's still with us. This is largely a history of that. So follow along, and this is going to touch on a lot of what I've been already discussing. So the term rhythm and blues, often called R&B, originated in the 1940s when it replaced the term race music as a general marketing term for all African American music. So this is important to remember. During segregation, even, music was segregated. So music made by African American artists would often be classified by the very fact that they were African American. So for a long time, that would be called race music. But then in the 40s, right around, World War II ending, they start calling it rhythm and blues. And this was a term that was used to refer to secular music. So this is a key distinction being made between rhythm and blues, secular music on one hand, and what would be considered like religious music on the other hand. Which would be like spirituals, and we saw some of those last week. We see references to some of those this week as well, but also like gospel music, the kinds of songs that would be sung in church, also like traditional Christian hymns, right? But then we'd also have, like sort of traditional spirituals that almost anybody from the, Christian tradition might have been familiar with. And then there were certain spirituals that were sort of considered more unique to the African American church. So that was religious music, but now we're talking about secular music. But as we know, there's going to be some crossover and, influence between the two. But rhythm and blues would refer to secular music from the 1940s on. And it was, associated with African American music. So the migration of African Americans to urban centers in the Northeast and Midwest during the early 20th century, the Great Migration, we talked about this last week, helped to bring various regional styles of African music together, often in one place or in one sort of area of a major city. So they began to influence one another, and the migration also created new markets for this kind of music, new audiences who perhaps had not been exposed to it before. So this blanket term, rhythm and blues, has kind of changed a bit since the 1940s, but it's still used today as a sort of umbrella term for many different African American musical forms. But if we're speaking historically, like going back to the era of Sonny's Blues, it's really going to break down into a couple of, popular music genres of the time. Some of it kind of more pop. Again, there was a lot of elements of gospel still present in the music, and then the blues, and jazz music. Okay? And all of these different kinds of music, though different in many ways, they had certain things in common. Certain things having to do with, rhythms, vocals, and a certain backbeat that characterized all of these different musical forms that were sort of just lumped together. Again, a lot of that had to do with the sort of unequal treatment that African American artists were getting at the time. So they were all just kind of lumped together, as race music originally, and then R&B music after the war. So often when we're talking about the blues and jazz in particular, those kind of came to be characterized by having smaller groups that often emphasized rhythmic drive over the instrumental and harmonic complexity of like swing music orchestras, which were also popular during that time. And the vocalists of blues and jazz music often sang in an uninhibited and emotionally direct style. And these aspects of style were foundational to the development of rock and roll a few years later. So if you're interested in pop culture stuff or kind of the history of rock music or the history of popular music in the US, this is kind of good to know because, yes, particularly the blues really served as kind of a foundation for what came to be known just as like rock and roll. A lot of you probably already know that. But now let's get a little bit more specific. So the blues is both a musical form and a musical genre. And of course, blues gets its name from its sort of original association with melancholy subjects and sounds. So of course, speaking colloquially, if we have the blues, that typically means that we are sad, we are melancholy, we're down for some reason. However, the blues has since developed to address many other subjects and many other emotions beyond just sadness. And also sort of adopting this wider sense of maybe in some cases even chasing the blues away through music. The main features of the blues include, and these are just a few things to keep in mind. If you're not a big music person, it's fine if you don't really know what all of this necessarily means, but we'll be able to at least grab a hold of a few of these like characteristics or traits of the blues. Specific chord progressions that will show up in a lot of songs. A walking bass, call and response, vocal patterns. Also dissonant harmonies, syncopation, and what's called a flattened or a series of flattened blues notes. Blues is also known for being microtonal, using pitches between the semitones defined by a piano keyboard. So this is often achieved on an electric guitar using a metal slide for a sort of whining effect. So as a result, the blues can be heavily chromatic. And as the blues have developed over the years, they have sort of encompassed other, or like bled into other genres. They've sort of created subgenres. Certainly we can talk about blues-based rock. I would argue that's most of like classic rock that you would hear from like the Rolling Stones or other big bands of like the 60s and 70s. But also country blues. And there's also some like regional subgenres of the blues, depending on what part of the country you're in. So there's the Delta blues down near the Mississippi Delta, like in Mississippi, Tennessee, and then the Chicago blues, which really was a result of the Great Migration. A lot of African Americans leaving the South, bringing some of their musical traditions with them and settling in places like Chicago, like the South Side, as we saw last week, and there'd be a lot of that music coming with them. So to keep going just a little bit, the blues originated in the Deep South, probably, in the years following the Civil War. It really didn't get sort of noticed and tracked by like, record label people or even like music sort of, people who sort of studied music in sort of more of a historical or anthropological way. Didn't really get noticed consistently until like the early 20th century. And it sort of grows out of the oral tradition of African American spirituals and work songs that had existed for a long time. They often featured this sort of call and response vocal pattern that's still pretty prominent in the blues today. And it starts to reach mainstream popularity around the 1920s. That's when it's, some of these songs first start to really get recorded and disseminated to a larger public. And it also sort of develops, a lot of blues songs develop sort of an AAB lyric pattern that you might be able to pick out if you're listening to them. AAB, like a poem, similar to how we would read a poem, thinking about rhyme scheme and how different lines are arranged. So as we probably know, again, just from sort of the term, the blues, a lot of these songs are centered around the pain of loss and injustice that was often experienced, by these African American artists. But it also expresses victory and triumph at times, and the ability to perhaps overcome some of these difficult experiences. And then, early on, a lot of blues music was sort of slow in terms of tempo. But as it became more popular, it sort of became faster, and of course, eventually it became electric in later decades. And so here's where it gets kind of interesting if we think about a divide or a separation between the blues on one side and jazz music on the other. The blues is really a predecessor to and foundation of jazz, while there are some elements that overlap. And, again, we can kind of notice that in the story because, Sonny definitely identifies himself as a jazz player, but when the narrator is in the nightclub listening, he's very much talking about the blues. So there's definitely overlap between the genres. And they have a lot of similar features. So here are a few similar things that show up in both kinds of music. Both styles use improvisation. So we've been talking about this. However, and this might be interesting to you, the improvisation sort of differs in blues versus jazz. So in the blues, the improvisation is usually reserved for a soloist who usually is working within a set number of bars and over a strict chord progression. So you'll often, at least in the electric blues, you'll often hear this with guitar players. And they are riffing, they are improvising, but often they are sticking to a set number of bars and a particular type of chord progression. Whereas in jazz, you would often have the entire ensemble, the entire band, improvising together. And for often an unlimited amount of time. So different, but both use improvisation as sort of a central component. And also, generally, jazz is a little bit less strict, and it's more polyphonic than the blues. So it uses a wider variety of chord progressions, can sometimes be a little bit more complex in terms of its composition. Also, this is kind of important for us, just thinking about the story, jazz is more likely to be purely instrumental, which is the case with Sonny's band. While blues most often centers around a vocalist who will sort of lead that call and response and articulate the song's subject matter. So some key differences that we can observe, but also similarities and just a lot of overlap in terms of the instruments that were being used. Often you'd find guitar, bass in both, drums obviously in both, piano in both, and also certain like brass instruments, trumpet, trombone, saxophone. Those would all be used both in jazz ensembles and blues bands. But as blues sort of continued to evolve throughout the mid-century and kind of climbed up into the 60s, it was increasingly played, like I said, electric, and that was a jumping off point for a lot of rock and roll as well. Sort of, a lot of those rock guys, a lot of those British rock guys really idolized American, African-American blues artists, many of whom were from the South or maybe based in Chicago or other places like that. And a lot of bands like the Rolling Stones, who took their name, I believe, from a Muddy Waters song. He was an old bluesman. A lot of cases, those bands kind of started out just doing a lot of blues covers and kind of styling themselves after these established blues artists, and then they sort of moved on from there. But anyway, I thought that just might be some interesting and useful info to file away. And you guys can find even more. I mean, if you're interested, I just did a quick Google search, grabbed a couple of things off of a few different sites and a few good articles, and you guys can do the same, really. If you're interested, you can dig even more. But what I thought we could do now is think about some ways to make these connections. So instead of just speaking broadly about, Baldwin being influenced by these different musical styles, what can we actually look at? Let's think a little bit more about, how we can actually pinpoint some specific passages or some specific words or sentences that we can then, sort of tie more directly or explicitly to the music. So I thought we could start with sort of what we've been doing before and think a little bit more about sentence structure. So when we talk about improvisation, when we talk about this sort of riffing, or if we're talking about certain kinds of rhythms, can we find that? Can we locate any of that stuff in specific sentences? If we're thinking about just how words are arranged in sentences, if we're thinking about sentence length, something that we talked about a bit with Kerouac, you could even think about punctuation, because again, punctuation is what's telling us to stop, right? To take brief pauses as readers. So in some cases, music might start and stop or pause or have certain transitions from one thing to the next. So we might find that a little bit similar at times to punctuation in a piece of writing. So we could start with sentence structure. What do we see in individual sentences that might connect to some of this music? And then we can think a little bit more about sound and cadence. If you think about the word cadence, this is kind of interesting. The definition of the word, if you look it up, typically you'll see something like, it refers to inflection of voice or a certain kind of modulation of a voice. But also, it has a very specific definition in the context of music. It is a sequence of notes or chords in a kind of closing or concluding musical phrase. So like at the end of a song, at the end of a musical number, you have something that could be called a cadence, a particular sequence of notes or chords that, again, usually comes near the end. It's like the conclusion or the closing. So that's a very specific definition connected to music. If we're thinking more about words or, whether we're reading or listening, we're often talking about inflection, emphasis, and how a certain pattern or rhythm can get established. So again, can we find that in the prose? Often with poetry, we can find it. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? Things like alliteration, assonance, consonants, internal rhyme, and obviously other more clear things like in rhyme or a set meter in poems will establish a certain rhythm, a certain cadence that we can notice as we're reading. Especially meter, because that's all about emphasizing certain vowels, right? Sort of landing hard, certain syllables, right? So landing hard on some syllables, not landing as hard on others. But also things like alliteration, where we're getting the same sound repeatedly, right? That's going to create a certain rhythm or pattern that we can hear, we can listen to it, but we can also track it as we read. So can we find any of that? We're not looking at poetry now, of course, but can we find any of that in Baldwin's prose? Then I also thought this might yield slightly less results, but I thought we could get even more granular and think about specific word choice. So do we find anything in dialogue, anything in the voices of the characters that maybe can connect to the music or, bring up potential similarities or influences, that will take us back to the music? Think about how Sonny talks, think about how the narrator talks. We don't really hear many other characters in the text. We get a little bit from a few others, but those are the two voices that we get a lot. And of course, the narrator is telling the story, and then we also hear his voice in conversation with Sonny. So we get a first-person narration here, but many people would argue that, Sonny is often the reader's focus, and we're often sort of thinking the most about him. So we can compare the voices of the two brothers, but also we can find some evidence of like slang occasionally showing up in the text. I actually meant to mention this last week with The Raisin in the Sun. There were a few specific instances of like what we might call mid-century slang, stuff that might not be very familiar to us. But they were, sort of phrases or uses of words that were sort of popular at the time, sayings, colloquial expressions, and we heard some of those from characters. Like we heard them from Benny, maybe from George, even if it's just something really common like baby. George referring to Benny as baby. And now I can't remember, Benny calls Walter some insult, like she calls him something, I can't remember what. Pretty early in the text, but again, it's I don't even think we get a footnote for that, but it's some sort of popular expression of that time period that hasn't really lasted, so we don't necessarily know it perhaps today, but we can look it up, we can sort of locate it in its proper context with a little bit of legwork. So we might be able to find some examples of slang or sort of popular expressions from that time that aren't going to be as familiar to readers now, 70 years later. Even things like characters humming a popular melody or singing some familiar lyrics from a well-known song, which we get here from the narrator. So that's actually one of the songs that I posted in the Week 5 module. An older blues song probably would have been thought of as lame by Sonny, but a song that the narrator knows, and a song that he kind of hums to himself after a very sort of, bad fight between him and Sonny, and we get a little footnote about it in the text. So you can think more about individual word choice, you can think about sentence structure, think about sound and cadence, maybe read some of these sentences out loud to try to identify rhythms, patterns, anything that might put us in mind of music, particularly these types of music. And then, obviously, let's deal with description. Let's deal with some specific description. I would start with the musical performance itself, which really kind of begins on page 367, extends to 370, which is, I think, the last page. You could also do a little bit of an interesting compare and contrast with that particular, the jazz or the blues song that we get in the nightclub versus the revival meeting out on the street that we get a little bit earlier in the story. So I wrote down that this takes place between page 362 and 364. Not as much detail, we don't get nearly as much description about the music itself, but a pretty striking scene as we get this sort of religious revival, which is just sort of a term that was not entirely specific to the African American church, but it was pretty important in a lot of those spaces, kind of an opportunity to save people, to like bring people into the fold. It's a chance for people to sort of, be saved by Jesus, specifically set up for like sinners or people who maybe had not been observant churchgoers for a while. It was a chance to kind of bring them into the fold, get them to, confess things that they had done and maybe start a new relationship with Jesus. So again, this might not be something that we're all familiar with. So if you're not super familiar with a revival meeting, that's worth looking up as well. That's worth Googling. It's funny that this comes up because in my English 101 class, we just read a very short narrative by Langston Hughes, another, important African-American author, called Salvation. And it's kind of a autobiographical story about his experience in a revival meeting as a young kid. They were often, there would be like a kid night or like a kid segment where they would try to save kids in the congregation, young members of the congregation. So it's this really vivid, powerful description of a revival meeting and all the pressure that young Langston feels, because he's supposed to go up there and say that he's felt the presence of Jesus and he's ready to turn over a new leaf, but he's just not feeling it. And everybody else in the congregation wants him to feel it. The preacher wants him to feel it. He's the last kid to go up there. He's like the last one. They're all waiting for him. It's like nighttime. They've been there for hours. And he just doesn't feel the way that he's sort of supposed to feel. But that's a great sort of evocation of a revival meeting, a great depiction of one, kind of what it feels like, what it looks like, what it sounds like. So again, something to Google, something that you could look into a little bit more. But obviously they're singing like hymns and spirituals, right? They're performing religious music. And it's kind of important to note that, Sonny and the narrator are familiar with that music, right? I mean, they grew up in the church as well. And Sonny even makes a joke about it, like, what a terrible song, Again, you get the feeling that maybe this is music that they had to listen to as children, maybe stuff that they sang in church, or they at least listened to it in church. And it's not the kind of music Sonny wants to play. He's obviously wanting to play secular music, what would have been called R&B at the time. But they're not completely divorced from the religious music traditions. And again, a lot of musicologists or whatever, music historians will point out the ways that the blues and jazz were influenced by gospel music and those old spirituals and work songs that were common to African American culture. So again, these dividing lines are not rock solid. There's always going to be some mixing, and these different kinds of music will always sort of influence each other, show up in different ways. But again, there is this separation often, and it was largely a device of record companies and promotional people, but even for the musicians themselves, right? The religious music was often what you grew up with, but then later you might gravitate more towards secular music, the blues or jazz. But of course, not everybody approved of secular music. We get this brief mention of their father and how he disapproved of R&B musicians, thought they were sort of shiftless, no good. And sometimes that was referred to as, the devil's music. It seemed to be encouraging, behavior that maybe was not always very godly. So again, there was an important divide, almost like morally and socially in some ways, between religious music and secular music. There were also stylistic differences, though, as we were just saying, there were stylistic similarities as well. But oftentimes for people in the church, for very religious people in these types of communities, post-war Harlem, not everybody would have approved, of Sonny's music. Not everybody would have approved of the blues or jazz, but they were growing in popularity throughout this time. So, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but, so we've just been going through things to look at more. Sentence structure, sound, and we were just talking about description. So sentence structure, sound and cadence, word choice, and then the specific description of the musical performance at the end, and then the revival meeting back on page 362. And you can kind of notice that they're different styles of music, but again, we can note similarities, and we can note that they both seem to deliver a pretty significant emotional impact. Maybe just different emotions, maybe working in different ways. So a few other things I just wanted to sort of point out. Again, we can push back a little bit on this sort of common interpretation that what we see in the nightclub is some form of redemption for Sonny. That he saves himself, or he somehow triumphs over his difficulties through his music. A lot of people read it that way. I think that reading or that interpretation has become so common to the point where it's almost a little bit of a cliche, and it's a little too simple, I think. For some readers, we can just sort of oh, it's neat, it's tidy, everything's going to work out, everything's good for Sonny. But is that the case? You could maybe think a little bit more about these characters and sort of what's next for them. Like, do we get a sense for what's next? How are they going to proceed? And a big part of it is a couple of symbols or tropes that you might want to work with a little bit more. One of them is the cup of trembling, which we hear that reference at the very end when the narrator is describing, once again, Sonny up there playing the piano. So you get a footnote. That's a biblical reference. It's okay if you're not all that familiar with it, but again, something that you might want to Google or look into a little bit more. They give you a gloss, a little explanation in the footnote, but you might want a little bit more. Typically, the cup of trembling is just viewed as sort of a general symbol for like fear and suffering. But how is Baldwin using it here? And how does it relate specifically to Sonny? Not only what he's been through, but possibly if we're thinking about what's next for him. So again, a lot of critics have started to come out and say, it's kind of an ambiguous ending, actually. It's not maybe immediately clear how Baldwin intends to use that symbol or what he means for that symbol to really sort of illustrate or communicate. So you guys can think more about that. And then finally, the darkness trope. So this gets repeated, at various points throughout the text. So it definitely bears a closer look. So I just marked down page 348, page 354, and then page 369 as three specific places in the text where the narrator mentions darkness, both as at times it's kind of both a literal thing, like it's getting dark or whatever, it's dark at whatever place we're in, but also this kind of figurative darkness that might be closing around certain characters. So on 369, we get this really wonderful sentence, while he's describing the blues. He's saying the blues, a song like what these guys are playing, it's not expressing really anything new. Right? The ideas, the emotional valences, they've been around. We know them. But they're still telling an important story. He says, the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, but it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. And it's the only, I'm kind of butchering this here. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. So again, go back to that flashback scene as well when he's describing sort of what it was like as a kid after church when all the family would sort of gather in the house and they'd, have a big meal. And afterwards, he's describing, sitting in the living room with his parents and other relatives and this feeling that he gets as it starts to get dark outside. But that's not the only darkness that he's talking about. There's also this kind of figurative or symbolic darkness that really gets tapped into more when his mom tells him the story of his father's brother, who he was never aware of before, and what happened to his father's brother. This idea of darkness, a sort of a darkness that might be associated with danger, oppression, injustice, and Sonny might experience something similar. So you can think more about how darkness is functioning in the text. And at the beginning of the story, we hear the narrator, who's of course a teacher, we hear him sort of apply this concept of darkness to the young kids that he teaches, sort of the next generation. So we get the sense that this idea of darkness, this kind of conceptual darkness, affects a lot of different characters at a lot of different stages in life. So that's definitely a trope or just an idea, a recurring idea. That's really all a trope is, just something that keeps showing up in the text, and it obviously has some kind of larger meaning or significance that we can figure out. So the final thing I want to mention is just some of the stuff that I put in the week 5 module. So if you guys go into Canvas, you'll notice that in addition to my, this lecture and the discussion post, there's all these different links to songs. So I thought it might be instructive to just listen to some jazz and blues songs. Because again, it can get rather abstract if we're just thinking about rhythm, cadence, improvisation. Like, we need to find examples of that stuff. Like, we need to actually grab hold of examples both in music and then maybe in Baldwin's prose as well. So I just wanted to run down a few of the songs that I'll just mention them all. You guys don't have to necessarily listen to every single one. I think I put like 9 of them in there, but at least take the time to sample a few of these. And I want to point out a few differences between them, just so you can note this as you go through. So the first song is just a pretty well-known song by Charlie Parker. Who is the jazz musician. He was a saxophone player specifically. The jazz musician that Sonny mentions in that aforementioned conversation with the narrator. So you can get a little bit more familiar with Parker. I didn't put a Louis Armstrong song in here. I probably should have, but you can just Google him or go to YouTube if you want to listen to an Armstrong song and then listen to a Parker song to start to notice differences and possible reasons why Sonny thought that Armstrong was old hat, outdated, and Parker was cool and really sort of cutting edge. I also posted a series of songs that have the word blues in the title. And I thought this would be a useful thing to do as well, because look at our title, Sonny's Blues. What you'll notice is that was actually a naming convention for a lot of blues and jazz songs. And I would argue there's a couple of different sort of levels of meaning that we could explore with this stuff. So on kind of a really basic literal level, and we might see the title of the story operating this way, sometimes it just meant that, okay, this is a blues song performed by this person, right? So it's Sonny's Blues. So some of the examples that I included are similar to that. So you got Albert's Blues by Albert Nicholas. Nicholas was a pretty well-known clarinet player, and later I think he was sort of like a band leader, but he played what would have typically been called, jazz. He was a jazz musician. But they used some of the same terminology. And again, there was all this overlap, like we've been saying, between the blues and jazz. So even though I think you'll kind of associate that song more with what we typically think of as jazz, because it's more kind of based on reed instruments and maybe brass instruments, no guitar, no vocals. But that's Albert's Blues, and that's just literally a song by a guy named Albert. So it's pretty clear on that level. Then you can see Billy's Blues. That's a blues song performed by Billie Holiday, who was a well-known, performer, well-known singer. So she performed a lot of blues and jazz standards, but her vocals made them sort of distinctive. So there you can listen to Billy's Blues, and it's kind of the same thing. But if you listen to Freddie's Blues, that's different, both musically and maybe in what it means on some level, because that's performed by this guy, Hound Dog Taylor, who was a Chicago-based bluesman. He was a little bit later than a lot of these other musicians. He would have been a little bit more like Sonny's generation. Billie Holiday, Albert Nicholas, Louis Armstrong, they were older. Kind of an older generation. But Hound Dog Taylor was playing in Chicago like in the 60s, and he was eventually discovered after rock and roll really started to hit it big, and there was kind of a blues revival. Because a lot of those old, rock bands would talk about their blues influences. Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton. They would talk about the blues musicians who often inspired them. And then those blues musicians would often still be alive, and they'd still be playing, in clubs and small venues and places like Chicago. And many of them were able to finally cash in off their music after years of just sort of barely getting by. But anyway, Hound Dog Taylor is playing electric blues, right? Much more akin to what we might think of as rock music. But I want you to notice the improvisation that's really present maybe in all of them, but you'll definitely notice it in Freddie's blues. So I don't know who Freddie is. That's not Hound Dog Taylor. That's not his name. So that's maybe somebody else's blues as performed by Hound Dog Taylor. But you'll notice that he's just kind of riffing and doing different things with the guitar, soloing, again, sort of the origin of the rock standard guitar solo. So you'll notice that improvisation. And you might notice it in a different way in Albert's blues. Obviously, the instrument is different. The sound is different. The mood is different. But Albert Nicholas is also improving with the clarinet, which of course sounds different than the guitar, but that sort of stylistic impulse to experiment, to take a journey, to put your own stamp on something. Again, that's something we can observe, and we can link it back to some of this literature. And then we also have Sonny Boy Blues. I think I just put that in there because of the title. That's Ted Lucas, who's kind of a lesser known artist. But that just sounds cool. It's kind of a different guitar sound that you get in that one. Again, more guitar based, sort of electric blues that served as a forerunner to rock and roll. But it sounds different than Hound Dog Taylor, you know, and again, it's incorporating certain rhythms. It's certainly incorporating improvisation, but you can notice some differences as well. And then I included two different versions of Am I Blue? That's the song that Sonny and Creole and the drummer up there in the nightclub are playing. So I included an instrumental version, which is going to sound a lot like what we would think of as jazz, because I think that's kind of an approximation of what those guys would be doing. But keep in mind, the version I posted, there's not a lot of riffing or improvisation there. That's just the song as it was written. And it's actually like a backing track, I think. You might supposed to like sing on top of it. I mean, it's just like the standard song that can be used for almost anything. So notice that one, and then you can listen to it with vocals. Pretty sure it's Billie Holiday again, providing the vocals. And it sounds a little bit different. I mean, it's the same song. You can probably identify the same notes, but it's a little bit more, you know, it has a little bit more of a full sound. And like we said, oftentimes, you know, the blues would have more of a focus on vocals, whereas jazz would often, at least more often, be instrumental. But that's not always the case. You can still have vocals with jazz, and some blues can be instrumental, so it's not always like that, but we can just sort of observe those general characteristics. And then Some Cold Rainy Day. I'm pretty sure that's the song that the narrator is humming, and they're not quite sure in the footnote. They're like, yeah, this is probably the song by Bertha Hill, which is from the 1920s. So another standard that had been played for a long time. You could hear it on the radio, and a lot of jazz and blues bands would have covered it. And again, maybe they would have riffed a little bit and made it slightly different, but everybody, you know, at least a lot of people knew that song. It was pretty popular. And then the final song is another Chicago bluesman, Freddie King, who, again, a little bit later, more like Sonny's generation. He was playing in the 50s and the 60s. And just sort of driving home the notion that Baldwin mentioned, that, you know, the blues are the blues. It's the same sort of thematic material. And like we read in the description, even a lot of the same chord progressions, even a lot of the same basic structures. But within that, you could put your own twist on it, whether through vocals, through improving on a piano, or on a guitar, or on a clarinet, or whatever. And not just expressing yourself, but also maybe expressing larger ideas. Maybe it serves a therapeutic function, and we haven't even talked about what it's doing for the listeners. What is it doing for the audience? How is the narrator affected in that climactic scene? how does the music impact us in the audience? So think about some of that stuff, listen to some new music, and even if you don't really dig it, I mean, you might play a few of these songs and you might think, I don't really like that. I don't think I like jazz, or maybe I don't like these blues songs, but just sample them. And maybe try to make some explicit connections between these songs I posted, and what we see in Baldwin's short story. So that's kind of what I'm asking you guys to do in this week's discussion post. Let's get more specific. Let's go beyond just saying Baldwin is influenced by music, and let's show some of the ways that that influence shows up in the text. So let's find some specific examples. You don't have to stick with my list. Again, you can go beyond sentence structure, but you should probably talk a little bit about sound, maybe about individual words, individual sentences, but also think about improvisation. Think about rhythm, cadence, improvisation, and you can also sort of think about how music can help us to understand the inner state of characters, like the mental state, the internal state of characters. How can music serve as like an entry point or a doorway into the psyche or the emotional state of a character? So let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys next week.